I don't know whether you're like me, and I hope you're not in this regard, but I have a memory problem. And that is that I can forget things I did just yesterday. And yet, there's certain things in my life that are just as clear as crystal, even though I was probably only about 10 years old when it happened to me. And one story in particular was that I was at school, and every year when the book club would come out, I always wanted Mum to buy me this calendar. And this calendar was full of stickers and everything that, you'd put up at the start of the year. And I just love this idea that I would have this calendar with all these stickers on. And every year I asked Mum, can we have one? Can I buy one? No, you don't need it. No, you don't need it. No, you don't need it. Then one year, the teacher just happened to walk down and put one on my desk. And wow, I've now got this calendar that I'd never had before. And I thought, this is amazing. How did I get this? And the boy next to me got one as well. I thought, this is brilliant. So I went home and I showed Mum, I got this new calendar. Finally, she goes, well, where did you get it? I said, well, it was given to me. She goes, no, where did you get it? You can't just take the calendar. I said, no, it was actually given to me. There was some left over. And because there was some left over, they said I could have it. And she goes, okay, well, that's very kind of them. But, all right, as long as that happened, that's all right. Well, about 2 hours later, my mum got a phone call. And the phone call was from the mum of the boy that I sat beside. And suddenly I could hear the conversation going, and then suddenly it was, James, come here. So I walk in, she goes, why did you tell me a lie? I thought for a minute, I didn't really think it was that much of a lie. It was put in front of me. It was my calendar. She goes, but it wasn't left over. It wasn't said to you that you could actually have it. In that, you told me a lie. Well, the punishment I got for that to this day is why I can recall this story to you. But do you know what is etched on my mind? How important it is from that moment of telling the truth. And so even the small little white lies or the things that we might tell that may not be wrong but lead people in the opposite direction intentionally has really been something in my heart and mind that I've never forgotten because of that event. And for a guy who can't remember what he had for breakfast yesterday, that's an amazing thing to think back all those years. And have you ever stopped to think, brothers and sisters, what is etched on your heart? Have you ever stopped to think some of the experiences that you've had in life, have they taught you such fundamental and key lessons that you've never forgotten them, even though you might not be able to remember what you had for breakfast yesterday? If you were to write down and record a key lesson in your life of something either through the positives or the negatives of your life that you learnt that was so deeply impressed upon your heart, what would it be? What would be the story that you would want to tell someone else? Well, brothers and sisters, do you know that our daily readings have been taking us through many wonderful psalms, each with a wonderful expression of the thoughts and the emotions of the psalmist? But do you know, we've actually been entering in over the last week to a series of psalms that were David's psalms, that were things that were etched into his heart. And he even tells us that. And therefore, these were key experiences and key lessons coming from his childhood, from his life, that he's written down, and it's been recorded for all of history by the inspiration of God, that we might come to understand the power and the emotion of the lesson that he learned, that we might take encouragement from that. And the psalm that our brother read this morning, let's just head there, is Psalm 57. Now, you'll notice at the top of Psalm 57, there's a few little inscriptions, and they're worth considering when we read the Psalms, brothers and sisters, because those inscriptions are there to teach us what not only the musical nature of the song was, but sometimes what type of psalm that David was recording and for what purpose. Now, sometimes it is challenging to get the various titles of the psalms because some of the psalms titles are actually from the psalm before. So you actually have to be very careful when working out what those titles are, because some of them are not actually placed directly in line with the psalm that we read following. They're actually there from the psalm before. But piecing together some of these from Psalm 57, you'll notice that it actually says that this was a psalm when David fled from Saul in the cave. Now, there's actually two psalms that have that exact same description. The first here is Psalm 57 and the other is Psalm 142. Now, in both of those psalms, they have certain titles. Now, Psalm 142 actually has the title that it's a maskil of David. And the word maskil, brothers and sisters, literally means it's instructive. It's a psalm written to cause a person to consider the teaching involved and behind it. And there's only 4 psalms that actually have that title. Psalm 32, Psalm 54, Psalm 55, and Psalm 142. And if you think about some of those psalms, they're very well known. Psalm 32 is the psalm that David wrote with the sin with Bathsheba. Psalm 54 was Doeg the Edomite. Psalm 142 here, a psalm of David in the cave. But you know, these were 4 psalms, just 4 psalms, that actually were written by David from key events in his life that were forever powerful lessons that he wanted others to consider and to pause and to think about, because they were so instructive that he wanted to have for others a teaching that they would get their heart and minds into. But if you notice in Psalm 57, there is a second little title here, and that is that it's a miktam of David. Now, the word miktam, brothers and sisters, actually means something that is engraved or inscribed. And the idea again is that it's inscribed on David's heart. In fact, it's something that is so significant in his life that is forever etched in his heart and his mind that he's sharing with us. Now, there's only 6 psalms that fit that. Psalm 16, if you think about what Psalm 16 is, a very messianic psalm. But then this little collection here of 56, 57, 58, 59, 60. And that's the cool thing, that if 57 sits between 56 and 58, and they all have this, we know for certain that 57 has it. So we know that here, this is a miktam. This was actually something, again, that was written from David's own personal experience that was forever engraved on his heart. Something so powerful in his life that forever it was there in his heart and mind. And yet there's a third inscription in this psalm. And the third inscription is the inscription Our Teskith. Now, I don't know if I can pronounce all of those things because I'm no Hebrew scholar, but Our Teskith actually means destroy not. We're going to come to that, but remember that phrase, destroy not. Now, only 4 psalms actually have this. It's Psalm 56, Psalm 57, Psalm 58, and Psalm 74. So you might actually see that Psalm 56 to Psalm 58 is a little collection, a dense collection of psalms written almost all around the same time about a period of David's life, brothers and sisters, which was immensely difficult for David. Immensely difficult. And more than that, he had to learn a key lesson. And that lesson was, destroy not. In other words, God will take vengeance. And that's a really difficult lesson to get our heads around, brothers and sisters, because when we're in difficulty, we just want the pain to go away. And so we try whatever we can to work out our own salvation, if we want to put it that way. But here was a lesson in David's life that he had to learn the hard way. Now, I want to take us back, brothers and sisters, and weave this psalm now through the historical background and see it come alive and see David's experiences in this psalm. So let's come back to 1 Samuel 20. And what we want to do, brothers and sisters, is just enter into the heart and mind and experiences of David for a moment so that we might come to appreciate this psalm a little bit more. Now, here in 1 Samuel 20, the chapter begins with him fleeing to Naioth in Ramah. He's fleeing, brothers and sisters, because Saul is hot on his tail. And he knows that really, if Saul gets him, he's gone, because Saul wants to remove him totally from the kingdom. And so here he races off to Samuel. Now, do you know, in David's darkest moments here, the foundation of David's kingship is laid. It is really that powerful. He became the king that he was because of these events. And I want you to notice how both Samuel and Jonathan play a huge part in the engraving on his heart. And we know the story. Just come to verse 12. Jonathan comes to David and he's willing to show his father's actions to David. What a faithful friend Jonathan was. But here he teaches David a really important lesson. And I want to come back to this later. So let's just tuck it away in the back of our minds for a moment. Just have a look at verse 14. Jonathan says, "You will not only show while I yet live the kindness of Yahweh, that I die not, but also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when Yahweh has cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth." Now, brothers and sisters, Jonathan knew that he could never be king. He knew that David would take over that kingship, and therefore he knew in a sense that his life would probably have to end. What an amazing friend that was. And so he asked David a very, very important thing. And he sets a promise. And if you notice in verse 16, they make a covenant together. It's so strong. But the covenant lesson that Jonathan was trying to teach David was this: that you have to show the kindness of Yahweh to those who you love as well as your enemies, regardless of your situation. And more than that, you have to trust God in His time to bring about His deliverance in your life. Now imagine that, brothers and sisters. David at this stage hasn't really been faced with an opportunity to test that. And we're going to see in this psalm, he is given that chance. So even then, you have to show kindness, even though my father is out to take your life. And so if we go across now into the next chapter, which is 1 Samuel 21, just have a look in verse 10, you'll see that such was the intense persecution that David faced from Saul, that in verse 10, David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul. And he even fled, brothers and sisters, to the Philistines. He fled out of Israel and he fled to Achish, the king of Gath. And down at that time, he was then faced with a massive trial again, because all the Philistines saw him and said, "Hold on a minute, isn't this David, the king of the land? Did not one sing to another of him in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? And he knew that his life was at risk again, brothers and sisters. And look at verse 12. "And David laid up these words in his heart and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath." This was one of those times, brothers and sisters, where it was etched on his heart, the difficulty that he was facing, and yet he had to learn to trust in God. Now this, brothers and sisters, is the basis of Psalm 56. Because Psalm 56 is all about fear, trust, and deliverance. And it's interesting that it says that he laid these words up in his heart. That is exactly what the word McCann means. It was engraved on his heart. And here he was sore afraid, to the point that he would flee even into a Gentile land. And yet Psalm 56 says, "At what time I am afraid, I will trust in you." That was the lesson that was engraved in his heart from this moment. So we can see in those Psalms, brothers and sisters, not only how David felt, but how he actually enabled the power of God to work in his life through those experiences, that they were so engraved on his heart that he would record them now, so that we might see the power of the lesson and the deliverance. That we might, in our difficulties and struggle, might use David as an encouragement to have that deliverance work in our own life. And so when we come now to 1 Samuel 22, do you notice that the chapter begins with David this time escaping out of the Philistine territory, and now he escapes to the cave of Adullam. Oh, now we have a cave. So this is the first time that we have David recorded here fleeing to a cave. Now, therefore, if we have two psalms, both, either we have the choice that both psalms were written at the one event, or that there's two separate occasions where David was in a cave. And we know that that's the case, brothers and sisters, because if you flick across to 1 Samuel 24, we actually have another occurrence of David fleeing to a cave. In 1 Samuel 24, it's the cave of En-gedi, but in 1 Samuel 22, it's the cave of Adullam. Now, I'm going to propose that Psalm 142 is the cave of Adullam. So Psalm 142 fits here in 1 Samuel 22. And again, it's worth trying to piece some of those things together, although it's not our exhortation this morning. But some of the things that you can parallel, Psalm 142 is about a time where David's spirit was overwhelmed. And it shows the extent that he went to protect even his family by moving them to Moab. Such was the immense pressure that he even feared for his family. Now, Psalm 142 talks about those who are his persecutors, those who were chasing him. And so therefore, brothers and sisters, again, the links between Psalm 142 and here in 1 Samuel 22, there's a lot of them, but we don't have time in our exhortation to piece them together. But worthwhile actually having a look at those two. But notice in verse 2 of 1 Samuel 22 that it says that everyone that was in distress came to David. So during this time, David actually had a cult following from all the, let's just say, the dregs of the land. And off they came to find their discontent with the way the country was being run by Saul in David. And this is important background, brothers and sisters, because when we come to 1 Samuel 24 in the cave of En-gedi, we now have a group of people with David that I believe the psalm is going to highlight the struggle that actually had for David and why. Now just come across to Psalm 57. Hold your hand if you can here in 1 Samuel 24, and let's just sort of piece together some of the little things that are occurring. Did you notice as we were reading through Psalm 57 that there's lots of doubles? There's lots of things that are repeated. For example, verse 1, be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me. So mercy is repeated. Verse 1, I put my trust in you. And if you look at the word refuge there, that's exactly the same word as trust. So it's mentioned twice. Even though in the English it's the word refuge, you can actually say, I will make my trust in you until the calamities be overpassed. Did you notice in verse 3 it says the idea of mercy and truth? And it's repeated again in verse 10, mercy and truth. Notice in verse 7, my heart is fixed, O God, my heart is fixed. It's doubled again. And then you'll notice in verse 5 and verse 11, the refrain or the chorus is repeated. This idea of be exalted, O my God, above the heavens, let your glory be above all the earth. It's repeated. So this is a psalm that's got doubles all the way through it. Well, why the doubles? Well, brothers and sisters, I believe that if we were to look at the record of 1 Samuel, there was one significant struggle that David was having, and that was with Saul. But now after the cave of Adullam, he had another significant struggle. You see, the people that came to him presented David with a massive temptation. Now, what does that mean? Let's just have a look at Psalm 57 verse 4. You see, he's actually even talking about these people. Verse 4, he says, my soul is among lions. I lie even among them that are set on fire. So he's talking about the group of people who are around him who are like lions. It's not just the fact that Saul was chasing him down. Here was a group of people, brothers and sisters, as he goes on to say, even the sons of men whose teeth are spears and arrows and their tongue a sharp sword. Who is he referring to? We'll just come back to 1 Samuel 24 and have a look at what happens here in the cave of En-gedi. You see, we know the story from Sunday school where David is in there with his chosen men, pretty much, or those who chose him, and suddenly Saul comes to the cave. And as he comes to the cave, he goes into the cave, the very cave where David and his men are hiding. And you know, brothers and sisters, as Saul goes in to cover his feet, as the AV says, it says that David and his men, in verse C, remained in the sides of the cave. But now have a look at verse 4. And the men of David said unto him, behold the day of which Yahweh has said unto you, behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it seemed good unto thee. David, here's the day that God has given you. Your enemy is right here in your lap. Take it. He's yours. Kill him. Remove your enemy. Surely God has set this up. This is the providence of God, that you can get rid of your enemy right here, right now. Destroy him now, David. Get rid of him, and then your problems will be over. Can you hear the echoes of Christ's temptation in the wilderness in Matthew 4? God said that he would give his angels charge over you. So do it. If you want it, take it now. It's yours. You know, brothers and sisters, we could only imagine what it would be like to take vengeance upon someone who is chasing us and hunting us down like that. But this was a huge temptation to David. And this psalm records that. This psalm records that those words that were said to him, go do it, go get rid of him, were like spears and arrows into him, because the natural reaction would have been to remove that. And in Psalm 57, we can enter into the struggle that he had. Look at verse 1. Until these calamities be overpassed. The word calamity, brothers and sisters, is actually the Hebrew word meaning to covet, an eager rushing towards, a desire of something that's wrong. And here David is actually saying, until this temptation subsides and goes past. And here he was amongst the lions who were set on fire. You see, the spiritual man, brothers and sisters, is here being attacked because the natural man wants to carry out his vengeance upon those who are set on fire. And you can imagine all the discontents who didn't like Saul. You know, he's a wicked king, get rid of him. You've got the opportunity. And it was so much a temptation and something that he had to work through that in verse 7, he says, my heart is fixed, O God, my heart is fixed. Do you know that word fixed there is the same word used in Psalm 51? And Psalm 51 is another psalm that David wrote about his sin with Bathsheba. And in Psalm 51, David calls upon God to create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me. The word right spirit is the word fixed that's here. So when David was going through that sin with Bathsheba, he asked God to create a clean heart and renew in him a fixed heart on things that were right. Renew a firm purpose of heart in me, not one swayed by temptation. And brothers and sisters, the record of 1 Samuel 24 picks that up as well. Just have a look at verse 4. It says, then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. And you can imagine him creeping across. You can see that he's been listening to these men, go and take your vengeance. And he's creeping across and he gets to Saul and he cuts off the part of the garment. And he comes back. And look at verse 5. And David's heart smote him for what he did, realizing how close he'd come and how silly he was even to cut off just the part of that garment. And he says to his men, Yahweh forbid that I should do this thing to my master, Yahweh's anointed, to stretch forth my hand against him, seeing he is Yahweh's anointed. And if we miss that lesson, brothers and sisters, if we keep going through, look at verse 10, he says it again. I will not put forth my hand against my Lord, for he is Yahweh's anointed. Verse 12, Yahweh judge between me and thee. So when he now is actually talking to Saul, he reiterates the lesson that he should have learnt from Jonathan. He goes, but Yahweh avenge me of you. Mine hand shall not be upon you. It's God who will take vengeance, not me. Look at verse 13. But mine hand shall not be upon you. Verse 15. Yahweh judge between me and you. Here, brothers and sisters, is the victory that David had at this day. That he came so close to realizing that he was going to kill Yahweh's anointed. And into his head pops the words of Jonathan. When you are still alive, show the kindness of Yahweh even to your enemies. And you know, brothers and sisters, what a beautiful lesson this was. And if we think that this was not easy for David, look at verse 7. It says, so David stayed his servants with these words and suffered them that they should not rise up against Saul. In other words, that was a physical restraint that he actually had to demonstrate to them. This was not, oh boys, sit down. No, there were some that would have grabbed their sword and, well, if you're not going to do it, I'll do it. And so David had to actually stand up and say, you will not do that. What an amazing character, brothers and sisters, David was in such a difficult circumstance. God forbid that I should do this thing and stretch forth my hand. It's about God's hand, not mine. Do you know, if we just come across to 1 Samuel 26 for a moment, we can actually see that these are the exact words that are quoted back to him. In 1 Samuel 26, and this is a beautiful chapter, isn't it? You know, again, shows these same themes coming through, and it's worth colouring them in as we go through. But do you know, here in 1 Samuel 26, just have a look here at verse 7 and 8. It's David and Abishai. They come to the people again, and Saul's sleeping. And of course, everyone's so asleep that they don't even hear David and Abishai walking through the camp. And here's the words of the sons of men who are like lions. Look at verse 8. Then Abishai says to David, God has delivered thine enemy into thine hand this day. Here it is again. This is providence, David. God is here. Take it. He's handing it to you. See the hand of God at work in your life, David. For someone like David, that would have been very important, right? And I love Abishai. Look at it. Look at this. Well, if you won't do it, I'll do it. I won't need to do it twice. I just do it once. I'll just pin him to the ground. Bang, it's done. I mean, what a guy. I mean, if you got to physically restrain someone, you wouldn't want to be physically restraining Abishai. And David says to Abishai, look at this, destroy him not. That's the word, brothers and sisters, in the Hebrew, our teskith. That's the title of Psalm 57. Destroy him not. That's why it was engraved on his heart. His heart smote him that day because he cut off the skirt of David. And he came that close to yielding to that kind of temptation. And so here he is, resolute. He says, for who can stretch forth his hand against Yahweh's anointed and be guiltless? And David says furthermore, as Yahweh lives, Yahweh shall smite him. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was standing in the midst of a whole group of 3,000 guys, I wouldn't want to be having a conversation with Abishai right now about some doctrinal matters, because if any of those guys woke up, both of us would be gone. But David took that opportunity to say, here's the key lesson, Abishai. And look at all the way through the chapter, verse 11. Yahweh forbid that I should stretch forth my hand against Yahweh's anointed. And even though he understood, look at verse 12, even though David understood that this deep sleep was from Yahweh, he still did not take that providence into his hands. Verse 16, he says it again, Yahweh's anointed. Verse 23, Yahweh rendered to every man his righteousness and his faithfulness. For Yahweh delivered me into your hand. There he goes. He's even recognizing that God is there. But I would not stretch forth my hand against Yahweh's anointed. Destroy him not is the key lesson. You see, that, brothers and sisters, is what was engraved on David's heart. Do you know, we've missed an important chapter here in 1 Samuel, and it's not the time to look at it, but did you notice that in 1 Samuel 25 is the lesson of that wonderful woman, Abigail? And that whole chapter is again about David and his enemies. And even Abigail tries to lay thick on David the importance of trusting God. We don't have time to look at it, but it's worth colouring in all the way through. Abigail comes to David and talks about my Lord, my Lord, my Lord. And she actually says, look at this in verse 26 of 1 Samuel 25. Now therefore, my Lord, as Yahweh liveth, and as thy soul liveth, seeing Yahweh hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, David. In other words, David, God has sent me to stop you from doing that. Because even though, humanly speaking, you might be justified in carrying out that action, or you think so, do you understand? And look at her words in verse 31, that this shall be no grief unto thee, nor offence of heart. David, your heart is like God's heart. So do not avenge yourself. You must trust him. You must not avenge yourself. And do you know that word, hath avenged himself, there in verse 31, is exactly the words that Paul picks up in Romans chapter 12. And we don't have time to look at it, but put it in your margin if you like. Romans 12, verses 17 to 21, is all about us allowing God to take vengeance. Vengeance is mine, says God. I will repay, not you. It is not the time for you, David, to take vengeance. And so, brothers and sisters, when we look at this and we try to think about how we could possibly emulate this characteristic in our life, if we want the answer to that, it's in Psalm 57. In the difficulties and struggles of whatever our life is going through, how do we emulate this kind of trust in God to let him work in our life to bring the answer and the conclusion? Well, Psalm 57 is David's heart on this matter. So let's try to pick out some things from the chapter. Verse 1 of Psalm 57. Be merciful unto me, O God. Be merciful unto me. Do you know this is the only time where David actually says that twice? Be merciful unto me is something that he says often, but this is the only time it's repeated. And I believe, brothers and sisters, is because David recognized how close he came to doing the wrong thing here. And that's the key, brothers and sisters, to any of our struggles. We've got to understand and recognize our own weaknesses. And in doing so, we can recognize how prone we are to act in the wrong way, and how much we need God in our life, and how much the answers can only be found in Him. And sometimes the answers are not going to come straight away. And we struggle with that. And we need God to forgive us when we, in a sense, have a little bit of a moment where we sort of say to God, what are you doing in my life? Why did this happen? And so, brothers and sisters, like David, verse 1, my soul trusts in you. See, there's the key. We've got to turn and say to God, I know that the only thing I can trust in is you. And we've got to believe that no matter what happens, brothers and sisters, we might think we have the answers, but we don't. That's why recognizing our weaknesses is so important. We turn to the only one who can. And that's why I love this beautiful little phrase in verse 1. In the shadow of your wings, I will trust. What an amazing little analogy. Have you ever thought of God having wings? The shadow of God's wings, I will trust. Now, a little awesome link, I think, is that word wings, brothers and sisters, is exactly the same word in 1 Samuel 24 as the skirt of Saul's garment. So when it says he cut off the skirt, it actually means he cut off the wing of his garment. What a little link back to that chapter where that's why his heart smote him. He cut it off and he thought, I've just cut off the wing of that garment. The wing? But I should be under the shadow of God's wings. Here I am nearly taking vengeance in my own hands when I should be under His hands and His wings. And so he starts off this psalm with the realization that it's only when he's under the shadow of God's wings will he be safe from the calamities until they pass over, until they're done. And when we think of this idea of God and the shadow of His wings, brothers and sisters, do you know how many Bible echoes come up when we start thinking about that? And what imagery that brings up? Let's just take a moment just to consider how beautiful these are. Do you know, right back in Genesis 1 verse 2, it said that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And that word move there means to hover like a bird. So here was this empty, formless lump of darkness. And it says that the Spirit of God hovered excitedly over it as He was about to commence His creation. And it's Deuteronomy chapter 32 that actually picks this up, brothers and sisters. And I'd like you just to come back with me there. It's really worth seeing because they're like bookends to the Pentateuch. Genesis starts, and then Deuteronomy 32 finishes with this idea of the shadow of God's wings. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, we have Moses' song, and the wonderful themes that come out from that actually take us back to creation. And here, if we have a look in Deuteronomy 32 in verse 8, and just hear some of the echoes that we're going to pick up in Psalm 57. When the Most High divided the nations their inheritance, when He separated the sons of Adam, and He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel, for Yahweh's portion is His people, and Jacob the lot of His inheritance. He found them in a desert land, in a waste howling wilderness. He led them, He instructed them. He kept them as the apple of His eye. As an eagle stirs up his nest and flutters over his young, spreading abroad his wings and taking them and bearing them on his wings, so Yahweh did lead him when there was no strange God with him. Brothers and sisters, that word fluttereth is exactly the same word in Genesis 1 verse 2 when the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. It's the analogy here of God as an eagle whose wings cover over the young and look after the young, protecting the young in their infancy. And just as He did that in creation, just as He did that with Israel in the wilderness, so He will do that in our life as well. because we are his heritage, we are his portion. And you notice what's fascinating is that this whole aspect of Deuteronomy also picks up some of the ideas of Israel being his inheritance. And if you want to put this in your margin, in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 26, it says, "And I prayed therefore unto Yahweh and said, O Lord Yahweh, destroy not your people or your inheritance," was Moses' cry of intercession as he records it in Deuteronomy 9, verse 26, when talking about Israel as God's inheritance. That word destroy not is our Hebrew word altaskith. Same concept. In other words, Moses was reminding God of the importance of his overarching care. A few other quotes, because I'm sorry we're probably going over time already. Exodus 19, God says to the people, "How I bear you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Isaiah 40, verse 31, "But those who keep waiting for Yahweh will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles." You can imagine David's imagery in that. But even right down to the work of Christ. In Matthew 23, do you remember when Christ was coming into Jerusalem? And there, as he looks over Jerusalem, he says these words, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee. How often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not." That's Christ's view of God with his people. If only you would have wanted God to overshadow you with his wings. And by the way, there's many occurrences of the phrase shadow of your wings in the Psalms. Psalm 17, it's a psalm about God's protection of his people. Psalm 36, about how we can put our trust in him. Psalm 63, how God is our help. It's all emphasizing, brothers and sisters, how important it is to see that we can come under the loving God who wants to gather his chicks around us. Do you know what's really beautiful, brothers and sisters? Each of those psalms which were written by David, have another theme in them. And that theme is the word loving kindness. It's the same word that Jonathan used to David in 1 Samuel chapter 20. It's as if, brothers and sisters, Jonathan's words were engraved on David's heart and he's weaving it through the lessons of his life as he comes out. That here is the example. You want to know the loving kindness of Yahweh? Well, have a look at the overarching shadow of his wings. And therefore, the words of Jonathan come back to him every day of his life. So when we come back to Psalm 57, here is David showing us how we can overcome these calamities, that they will come and pass. And the reason for that, brothers and sisters, in verse 2 is he says, "I will cry unto God most high, unto God who does and performs all things for me." You see, brothers and sisters, here's the key. The key to anything that we struggle with in our life is to make God most high. In other words, to put God higher than our problems. And this is exactly what David is doing. And you can see it all the way through this psalm. Verse 2, he's called the Most High. Verse 3, where does he send for help? He sends to heaven for help. He goes up, and so therefore he sends forth his mercy and truth. And then again in verse 10, when talking about the mercy and truth, he says it's so great that it's great unto the heavens. And then, of course, the refrain of verse 5 and 11. Be exalted, O God. There's the key. Exalt God above the heavens. Exalt him above the challenges, above the problems. That's the message of David, brothers and sisters. Now, again, we don't have time to turn to it, but if you want to put in your margin Colossians chapter 3. Do you know the chapter begins by saying, if therefore we are risen with Christ, he says this, set your mind above earthly things. So here's the answer that even Paul is trying to pick up. If we want to overcome the struggles, the temptations, the trials, then if we are truly risen with Christ, then set your mind above those things. Elevate your mind up to the things of God. Exalt him. Because, brothers and sisters, David was confident that God would perform all things for him. And that word God, brothers and sisters, there is the Hebrew word ail, which means strength. He is the strength who will perform all things for me. So do we see God like that, brothers and sisters? You know, Paul did, didn't he? Philippians 1. He says, being confident of this very thing, that he which has begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. Why? Because he goes on in Philippians 2 to say, verse 13, for it is God which works in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure. He says again in Hebrews 13, now the God of peace that brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, through the blood of the everlasting covenant, make you perfect in every good work, to do his will, working in you that which is well-pleasing in his sight, through Christ Jesus, to whom be glory forever and ever. Are we confident, brothers and sisters, that God will perform all things for us? Because David was, and so he says in verse 3, he will send from heaven. He will save. And here is the confidence in the mercy and the truth of our God. You know, when you think of mercy and truth, brothers and sisters, we think, don't we, straight away of the character of God in Exodus 34. He keeps mercy for thousands. He's abundant in goodness and truth. That's the character of our God. But isn't that also a clear reference to who we come to remember this morning? You see, those two words encapsulate all that Christ is. John 1 says the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. He is the embodiment of those two principles, the declaration of truth, but also the very means by which God will extend mercy. And I don't know about you, brothers and sisters, but if we're called upon to use these Psalms of David to gain strength, do you ever imagine that the Lord did as well? Of course he did. These were the things that underpinned his life. In fact, this entire psalm and all that David went through are the echoes of the Son of God who was hunted down and betrayed. And so when it talks about, brothers and sisters, how David would trust in the shadow of the wings until these calamities be overpassed, he knew that there would come an end to them because God would bring him out the other side. It's Christ in Luke 22 that actually says in verse 37, for I say unto you that all that is written must be accomplished in me. It's going to happen. I do have to go through these calamities because it was reckoned among the transgressors. But notice that he says after that, for these things concerning me have an end. They're going to finish. They're going to overpass. There's a joy that is set before me that I know is and I'm confident in. And when here in this psalm, David cries to God Most High, the first occurrence, brothers and sisters, of the phrase Most High God in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 14. And in Genesis chapter 14 is when Abraham went to Melchizedek and they had bread and wine together. And so here is Christ gathering his disciples around because with desire, he desired to have this last supper before he suffered. But do you know what he told them? That the next time he would have that is with them in the kingdom. Wow! Straight away, the calamities are going to be overpassed. He was taking them to the very time where they would enjoy bread and wine as kings and priests. And so therefore he says, I will send to heaven for my help. And what's beautiful is in Luke 22, in the Garden of Gethsemane, it says, there appeared an angel from heaven unto him. Of course angels come from heaven. Why tell us that? Can't it just say an angel came to him? No, it tells us that God from heaven sent his help to his son because his son desperately needed it at that time. And so the refrain, be exalted above the heavens, brothers and sisters, is exactly what John 12 tells us Christ did. You know, in John chapter 12, verse 27, Jesus says, now is my soul troubled. And you can enter into his heart and his mind. And he goes, and what shall I say? He goes, Father, save me from this hour. But for this cause came I unto this hour. But Father, glorify your name. As if there in that moment, brothers and sisters, in the difficulty and the struggle, he could turn his attention and say, God, your name be exalted above the heavens. And so God answered him straight away and says, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. And that was the voice from heaven encouraging him on in that moment. So brothers and sisters, when we look at Psalm 57, we see an amazing lesson of a heart that has been ascribed for us, that we might have the same power in our life when we go through difficulties. But I'd like you just to come, as we prepare for the emblems, to one final aspect, brothers and sisters, and it's here in Romans chapter 3. Our brother Rob mentioned it in his prayer. Because in Romans chapter 3 is a beautiful example of the shadow of God's wings. You see, Romans 3 is all about how all have come short of the glory of God and all stand guilty before God. But in verse 21, there is a righteousness that comes from God. This righteousness that comes from God is on faith, is on the basis of faith to all those who believe. And therefore we have been justified freely through the redemption that is in Christ. And we're told, brothers and sisters, in verse 25, that God has set forth Jesus to be a propitiation. Now, the word propitiation means a mercy seat. Now, if we go back to the law, brothers and sisters, the mercy seat actually sat on the Ark of the Covenant. And it was literally the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. But on that lid, brothers and sisters, there were two cherubim that stretched over. And the wings of the cherubim literally went like that. And they touched. And their faces looked down to the mercy seat, the place where the blood was sprinkled by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. So imagine the imagery, brothers and sisters, that you have there at that mercy seat. You have a place where God is going to extend mercy, but it's only on the basis of the truth being revealed and demonstrated, the righteousness of God upheld by the shedding of that blood. But overarching, brothers and sisters, is God's amazing care, the shadow of his wings that then look down upon that mercy seat. And there, brothers and sisters, is every person's only hope, demonstrated by God's overarching care. So when we come to think, brothers and sisters, how important it is to have that focus in our daily life, and the importance of David writing down some of the things that were etched on his heart, maybe that's something that we can do day by day. Write out a prayer, write out our struggles, place them on a note and hand them to God. Because, brothers and sisters, Paul tells us in Hebrews 4 that we are able to confidently come before our God. And we know these words well, but just listen to them now as we partake of the emblems. In Hebrews 4, we're told that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God. Therefore, let us hold fast to our confession. For we have not a high priest that cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Because of that, let us therefore come boldly, confidently, before the throne of grace, before the mercy seat, under the shadow of God's wings, that we might find grace and help in time of need.